Welcome, everyone, to Talking Back to Suicide. This is one of your hosts, Dr. Diane Kaufman, though please call me Dr. Diana for my creative self. I'm a poet, artist, humanism, and medicine awardee, a retired adult and child psychiatrist, and I'm the founder director of the Hold On campaign for suicide prevention that uses the power of art to educate, connect, express, and heal. My co host is Kino Isaac, who's coming to us from South Africa. And Kino is a DJ, music producer, entrepreneur, and very importantly, an advocate, a mental health advocate for independent artists. And our special guest today is Dr. Julie Erickson, PhD, who is an adult and geriatric clinical psychologist, nationally and internationally sought after educator. Dr. Erickson is an adjunct faculty member with the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto. Together with co-author Neil A. Rector, PhD, she wrote the Aging Well Workbook for Anxiety and Depression, which has received high praise from the esteemed Judith Beck, PhD, president of the Beck Institute for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. Drawing upon skills in cognitive behavioral therapy with integrated aspects of dialectical behavior therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, schema therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy, Dr. Erickson helps individuals with a variety of mental health distress and disorder presentations make positive change in coping with life's challenges. She's also dedicated to transforming ideas on aging itself as understood and acted upon by the general public and mental health professionals. In that spirit, she provides evidence-based workshops for mental health providers on best practices in working with older adults, including, for example, recognizing and reducing ageism in mental health care. She holds a Bachelor of Arts honors from MacEwan University and Master of Arts and PhD in psychology from the University of Manitoba. She completed her predoctoral residency training at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, Canada, with rotations in mood and anxiety, outpatient, and the women's inpatient unit. Her research has been published in so many places and journals, including Depression and Anxiety, Cognitive and Behavioral Practice, and Clinical Psychology Review. She has brought her research findings to the public in meaningful ways. And adding to all this on a personal note, Dr. Erickson enjoys taking improv comedy classes. So, very warm welcome to you, Julie, to Talking Back to Suicide.
Thank you so much for having me. And I will set the bar lower right now, and that just because I take improv comedy classes doesn't mean that I am funny. So let's lower your expectations right out of the gate.
Well, we're laughing.
But yeah, thank you so much for having me here today.
Julie, what led you to your interest in psychology?
Yeah, so I would say that one of my early experiences that led to being more interested in not only psychology, but in working with older adults specifically was my first job when I was 16, 17 years old. And was working in the recreation department of a long term care facility. And as a 16-year-old, this was my first exposure to things like Alzheimer's disease and to anybody who was north of 80 years old. So it was quite an eye opening experience at the time, and one that made me really fall in love with this stage of life and ultimately have a really deep level of curiosity about the different trajectories that people can take as they get older and what makes certain people resilient and approach later life with a sense of optimism and openness. And then the people that really struggle, and what distinguishes sort of these two groups of people. So that early experience really motivated me to pursue, a career in psychology And thankfully, even though I was very young at the time and making a big sort of career decision to pursue, doctoral training in psychology, it by and large has worked out really well in that I really enjoy working with older adults, now and find that there are always new, really fascinating things that I'm learning all the time about, the third act of life.
Which makes me want to ask you, what have you learned recently that has inspired you?
Yeah, well, I think one of the more interesting papers that I've come across that was, I think, just published in 2026 really helps challenge the idea that it's all downhill after a certain point as we get older. And a paper published by Beck, who's done a ton of really fascinating longitudinal research. But this particular study looked at the idea of gains that are still made both in our physical functioning and our cognitive functioning and our emotional functioning, and over a span of about 12 years, there was a sizable portion of this sample that reported significant gains or improvements in various aspects of their physical functioning, their cognitive functioning, or their social or emotional functioning. So I think that study is particularly important because it's such a deeply ingrained belief for all of us that it's all downhill after a certain point, or that aging is sort of defined by loss or decline. And so, yeah, I'm really thankful for studies like this, which maybe help to challenge some of those, deeply embedded ideas.
How does the research define the word old or
Yes.
older? On a personal note, I'm 73.
Yeah.
And recently, I forget how this came up, but I was thinking about, well, I didn't want to call myself old. I thought I'll call myself older.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Which I don't know, linguistically, I guess there's a subtle distinction. So
Sure. Yes.
what is, quote, "old"?
Yeah.
Is age really just a number or not really?
Yes, yeah, both really good questions. So it's interesting in the academic literature. So, although we see later life as a distinct developmental stage that we see spanning, age 60 plus, within that, there are, distinct chapters of later life where there are different types of challenges or strengths that emerge. So in the research literature, they more colloquial term the young old in the 60 to 75 range. And then we've got sort of like the mid old between, 75 to 85. And then the very creatively titled oldest old that are like 85 plus. And so researchers have sort of made this distinction. And I think historically, some of this distinction is not only wrapped up in kind of developmental research around changes we see physically or cognitively in these different stages of life, but also tied to things like average age of retirement, right, which has historically been 65, although there has been some fluctuation over the years in that number. But 60 to 65 seems to be kind of a key threshold, right, for any number of different changes that are happening, not only in your life circumstances, but in your physical functioning, your risk for chronic or acute illness or disease, mobility or functional changes, changes in the roles that you embody in your life, changes in your social circle. So, whether you want to call it old or not, later life or late adulthood is kind of some of the terms that I commonly use to refer to this time.
Is there a gender difference in terms of aging?
Yes. So to a certain extent, and it kind of depends on what you're looking at in terms of, how people age or the types of challenges that they face as they get older. So with women having higher rates of life expectancy, they're maybe just around longer to experience, different types of risks, whether it's for physical health conditions or mental health conditions. And we know that even if we're looking at sort of like mental health risk factors and how those differ depending on gender, I mean, we see certain trends hold up that are present earlier in life. So, for example, women are typically at higher risk of anxiety disorders, and that remains the case in later life. And men being at higher risk of things like substance use disorders or major depressive disorder, and that remains the case, in later life. Now, I would say gender differences can also show up in sort of the resources or strengths that people are accumulating and bringing into later life. I think probably maybe stereotypically, women, if I can make that generalization, have typically been more oriented around establishing relationship supports. And I think that can be one area of difficulty for older men in particular. And perhaps it's because due to things like you've relied on a spouse to be the sort of social mobilizer. Or perhaps it's more traditional norms or expectations of masculinity and how that poses barriers to connecting with other people. But I think sort of I've seen some of these differences sometimes in the social strengths or resources that men and women bring to the table as they get older, with men perhaps struggling a bit more.
Can you speak to cultural factors and how that influences the older population?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, broadly speaking, and culturally embedded, I'm going to focus on beliefs here, right? Can impact how people experience aging, their expectations of what growing older looks like. There can be different cultural expectations around elder care, right? And of course, some of the challenges lie here when some of these expectations are not met. So I've in my own clinical practice, seen tensions emerge when older adults from particular cultural backgrounds who have expectations that their adult children will take care of them, be, you know, primarily looking after some of their, medical issues, or even expect to go live with, their adult children. Conflict emerges, right, when those expectations aren't met. So culturally, I see some of those beliefs or expectations show up for people in later life. And if you want to even take cultural, stuff a little bit more broadly, our beliefs about aging play a very powerful role in shaping our experience of getting older. So I'll bring it back to Becca Levy, the researcher that I was mentioning earlier, and she's done some really fascinating research looking at how, again, longitudinal research, looking at how people's beliefs about aging are associated with mortality. So meaning that people who hold more positive beliefs about aging live an average of 7.5 years longer, which is pretty astounding.
Pretty amazing.
It is pretty amazing, even after you control for health status, education, income levels. So our beliefs about aging, which are very much culturally driven, play a large role in shaping our experience of getting older, for better or for worse.
Our conversation brought to me something I hadn't really thought of before. Recently, I was reading something about how I think across the world, the birth rate is decreasing.
Yes.
And in our conversation, all of a sudden I thought, wow, no grandchildren. What
Yes.
does that mean for the older population? Could you speak to that?
Absolutely. So, with changes that we're seeing in population demographics, we're sort of seeing an increasingly lopsided age distribution, right? Where there are a lot fewer children being born into the population and a greater proportion of adults who are aging. And it's estimated that, about a quarter of at least the US population and the Canadian population will be over the age of 65 by 2030. So I think that shifting age distribution has wide ranging consequences for everything from social security safety nets to elder care arrangements as people to get older, to our workforce, right, to pension systems. Like, it has very broad reaching consequences. And if we want to be alarmist about it, we could probably be pretty scared by some of these shifts in demographics. But I think it also invites, or maybe provides some opportunities to really harness some of the strengths of an aging population, which I think there are many. Sometimes people get hung up on, the consequence of having an aging population is all the burden this is going to place on our healthcare systems, right? Or similar types of sentiments. But I also think at the same time is that older adults have so much to offer society in terms of their knowledge, their wisdom, their creativity, their excellent problem solving ability. So I think all of that is something we should be taking more seriously and looking at how do we better harness and use, some of those valuable strengths.
I know for myself personally, and I'm sure I speak for many older adults who have grandchildren. And I would say also that connection with children not necessarily has to be a biological child, but there's a child in their life somehow. That has given me so much vitality and meaning and purpose, contribution, a way to express love and to be loved. In fact, on my I have 2 grandchildren, one who's 12, the other's 8, and when the 12-year-old had really literally had just been born and I was coming here to Oregon where I now live, but I was living in New Jersey. When I was flying back, quote, "home" on the plane after her birth, on the plane, I had an epiphany, and the epiphany was I was not going home. I was leaving my home, and I decided I was moving to Portland, Oregon, and within that was in April, and by August, I had moved to Portland. So, I'm just giving this an example of how profound this was, right? May Could you speak on that and also the idea of meaning and purpose and the idea of family, belonging? Like, it was like
Yeah.
I belonged with the grandchild and my daughter and the family. That sense of belonging happened miles up in the sky, but was so powerful. It was like, "You're gonna lose your mind if you don't move."
Yeah, yes, yes. So many thoughts about this. So we know that I'm going to call it so the idea of intergenerational linkages,
Mhm.
become, more important in later life. And that includes things like, how you relate to members of your own family and the strength of the connections there, but also your chosen family, your friends, your community. And I feel like the sense of kind of mattering to those around you is particularly critical, especially as older adults might see shifts in other roles that they've embodied in their life. So perhaps as you retire, having another way in which you feel like you matter or you're useful, right? Or that you experience meaning or purpose is really critical. And so I think a lot of people sort of turn to their relationships and intergenerational ones, especially to kind of get that need met. Now, the other flavor of this that's also really interesting is that if we look at developmentally what's happening in later life, there's a shift in time perspective that happens as we get older. And this comes from Laura Carstenson's research, who's out at Stanford University. And as we get older, we start to get the sense that time is running out. And so when you start to feel like your time horizons are shortening, that makes people start to prioritize different types of things. So people are prioritizing the relationships that they know tend to feel the best, the most meaningful, right? The most supportive versus going out and trying to meet a bunch of new people, right? You're really wanting to prioritize the surefire bets, the things that feel the best relationally or in terms of your activities. So, time running out can make us be more deliberate about choosing the things that we know feel good in the here and now. So, that might be, another reason why older adults are maybe more relationally motivated or motivated to spend time with the people, family or otherwise, that feel the most satisfying or the most meaningful to them.
I read somewhere, and I perhaps you can speak more to the statistics on this, but loneliness is compared to smoking so many cigarettes a day as a negative factor on your health. Could you speak to that? And also
Yeah.
the idea of loneliness and risk of suicide.
Yes, absolutely. So we know, and the statistic is more around kind of chronic persistent loneliness, right? Being equivalent to smoking about 15 cigarettes a day, right? So the impact, the mortality risk associated with chronic persistent loneliness is very real. And we know that as far as a risk factor for suicide goes, so feeling isolated, alienated, it is certainly a very strong risk factor for suicide, arguably at any age, and that sort of remains the case in later life. And I mean, it's important to clarify here too, because with the idea of loneliness in later life, it can be to a certain extent a misconception that all older adults are sad and lonely. So, loneliness is not necessarily something that skyrockets purely because of age, but it's more about circumstances that emerge in later life that are risk factors for loneliness. So things like being widowed, being single or divorced, all risk factors for loneliness, as are things like having a chronic illness or a disability, having mobility issues, having untreated depression. Like these are more of the things that are the predictors of loneliness versus age per se. And by extension, also things that increase risk factors for suicide as well. So in later life, I mean, we see some of the things that are classically associated with suicide risk. So things like major depressive disorder or alcohol use disorder. But for older adults, it's a lot of different types of chronic illnesses or diseases. So cancer, chronic lung disease, neurological diseases, COPD, or just not being able to complete your activities of daily living independently anymore. So it's not just sort of mental health stuff that's happening, it's that right alongside changes in physical health functioning that really increase older adults' risk of suicide.
Can you also add to that conversation um, the feeling or potentially the reality of being a burden? Because I know
Yes.
that that's a risk factor too.
Yes, absolutely. Perceived burdensomeness is a strong risk factor. I mean, at any age, but particularly in later life. And so I think, again, if someone is struggling with a chronic or acute illness or disability that renders them in need of a lot more care, right? I can see how that would lead to a feeling of being a burden, either to friends or family, or in other cases, we know that things like anticipating admission to a nursing home is also a risk factor for suicide in later life. Again, perhaps speaking to feeling like a burden or anticipating being isolated from others. So, yeah, all of these things are sort of, yeah, critical risk factors to consider.
What about the sense a person might have that they don't perceive themselves as being a burden. They see life as a burden.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, in terms of more feelings of overwhelm, like overwhelm about, navigating day to day. And I think that understandably comes up when people who experience more functional impairment, mobility issues, where it does take a lot more energy to get through the day and get things done that need doing. Right, getting to the bank, right, or making a meal, or even showering, right, might become that much more overwhelming and exhausting to do. So, yeah, I think you raise a good point that life feeling burdensome is also a factor here, too.
So what if, well, I am an older adult, right? I'm in what, that mid old. I come to you as a patient client and I'm feeling anxious and depressed and you're empathizing with me and I have a good connection with you and you're offering me cognitive behavioral and dialectical behavioral suggestions, et cetera, et cetera. And I say to you, but Dr. Julie, I'm too old to change. I should have done this change 50 years ago, and I wish I did, and I'm full of regret for that.
Mhm.
But don't ask me to do the impossible. I can't change. I'm too old to change. But
Yeah.
how would you respond to that?
Yeah. So, I think any important therapeutic work with older adults involves a discussion of ageism, and ageism in many forms. And what you're talking about there is a form of internalized ageism, right? The belief that, once we hit a certain age, it gets harder to change or it's impossible to change, right? If you're after a certain age. So I really like to illuminate, right, for people. And if, I was working with you, we talk about the various different forms of ageism that exists and what beliefs have been internalized by that individual. And from there, really start a conversation around how did someone learn that, right? How did they learn that after a certain age that it becomes impossible to change? What from their own life experiences, right, have led them to believe that that's the case? And I think there's value in providing some psychoeducation here too around, I mean, thankfully, the large scale research on therapy effectiveness for older adults demonstrate that there's no age difference in the effectiveness of psychotherapy for older adults. So, research does give us some optimism, right? That the work we do here in therapy can be just as effective for older adults as it is for younger adults. And better yet, older adults tend to have a lower rate of dropout in psychotherapy. So once they're in, they're in. So sometimes some of that information, even though it may not align with someone's subjective experience, can help push back, right, against some of those deeply ingrained ageist beliefs. Now, you also mentioned regret, right? Regret not having done this sooner. That's something I hear quite often with my clients, particularly if they've had some benefit, right? Or some success. And they're like, oh man, I really wish I would have started this or learned some of this earlier in my life. And to that, I would really try to both kind of normalize regret. Like we're all going to look back and have things that we wish we would have done differently, started earlier, or didn't do altogether. So, contrary to sort of popular belief that we should live life without regrets, having regrets is actually a really normal part of the human experience. And ultimately, when you're here now, when you're doing this work now, what an incredible gift to give yourself at this point in your lifetime. And maybe it's still worth it, if you've got 20 years left, 10 years left, 5 years left, who knows? But if those years are a bit better than the ones before, maybe that's still worth it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
I think it would be.
Yeah.
And speaking of ageism, yeah, you made me think about body image. And I grew up, I guess, with a belief that was externally implanted. Men get better looking as they age, and women don't. Could
Yeah.
you speak to that in broad strokes, as well as the idea of there's not only the body having run its course and maybe in quotation marks failing us now,
Yeah.
and also the idea of the body just like, no, my spirit is in this body, but it's not as attractive as I once was, or I think I once.
Yes, totally. And those first two beliefs, like you'll for people who are just listening to this, my eyes rolled down the street as you were saying that because those are such deeply embedded stereotypes. The whole like men get hotter as they get older and women look like, old crones. And so I think a few pieces of this. So the first piece is that women face both the intersection of ageism and sexism as they get older. So they're hit with kind of a double whammy, right, of both ageist beliefs and unreasonable expectations, because they're women, right, to look a certain age or, defy aging. But in this judgment is also the idea that aging bodies are unattractive, right? There's sort of we hold youth up on a pedestal as sort of being exemplary of what is physically attractive. And so older bodies are de facto seen as less than, inadequate. Oftentimes, older adults are seen as asexual. We don't see a whole lot of older bodies sexualized or as seeing as sort of objects of sexual desire. And there's probably something that clusters there with sort of ableism and not seeing, let's say, bodies that have disabilities as being sexual either. So I think it's deeply rooted culturally, right? And some of these beliefs around who is entitled to be sexual, who do we deem as being physically attractive from a cultural standpoint, but also how then that gets internalized by older adults. And perhaps you start to see your body in a more negative light or see wrinkles or sagging or stretch marks, right? As,
There's an entire cosmetic industry.
oh,
The
yes, there's a
and
lot of people that profit, right, off of hatred of aging bodies, right? Just even the whole idea of sort of the anti-aging, movement is really
aging too, in terms of Botox treatment or other
yes,
interventions that
yes,
it's are there young women in their 20s and 30s or even
yes,
40s or 50s who are
yes.
using these treatments preventively at very, very young ages? What do you think about that?
I think it's pretty sad that we become so phobic of aging faces, aging bodies, that we are resisting it so much that we're spending, this is a multi-billion dollar industry, right? That people are participating in. And ultimately, like aging is a normal, natural, and neutral, human experience to have. So I'm not quite sure why we've associated wrinkles, fine lines, sagging body parts with something that needs to be fixed. But ultimately, I think that is the underlying current that drives a lot of fixation, obsession with the drive to appear young.
Thank you for that. It's also leading me to be thinking that in terms of suicide, that and correct me if I'm wrong, but really, I think the highest proportion is the older population. However, it's also the second leading cause of death, I think, for what is it? Something like 15 to 34 or 10 to 34 across the United States. It's the 11th leading cause of death overall in the United States. But older men have the peak suicide. And yet, of course, we all want to say we want all people to be prevented from killing themselves. But I think the major advertisement promotion is related to youth suicide and not the older population. Could you speak to that?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So if you look at data, like if we're looking at American data from the CDC as of 2023, the rate of suicide for older men specifically is 3 times higher than what it is for younger adults. So younger adults being in kind of teens to mid 20s. So it's much higher, right, for older men. And you're exactly right. It's older men who are driving this trend, right? Not older women. And we know that, over across all age groups, men tend to outnumber women in terms of completed suicide. And the ratio of that worldwide is about kind of 3 to 1, right? 3 men dying by suicide for every 1 woman. But with older adults in some countries, that ratio is 12 to 1. So yeah, that ratio, that gendered ratio is just more elevated in later life. And the other thing I would highlight, just in terms of some of the epidemiology around suicide in later life, in addition to gender differences, is around lethality of methods. So suicide, attempts in later life tend to be much more lethal. So as context, the ratio of non-fatal to fatal methods, in young adults is roughly 200 to 1, right? So 200 non-fatal attempts for every 1 fatal attempt. But for older adults, it's about 2 to 1. So 2 non-fatal attempts for every, fatal attempt. So again, it just really brings into context the extent of the risks that occur in later life and how, statistics are much more, elevated, the prevalence being much higher for older men.
Do you think there's an element of ageism in terms of not talking about older men and suicide?
Absolutely. Absolutely there is. And I think what we brush up against too is just unfortunately this idea that, of a certain age, if you've got chronic health conditions, if you're lonely, if you think you're going to die soon, then it's sort of seen as sort of like an understandable thing why someone would take their own life, which is a really unfortunate way to look at it. But I think that's one of the narratives that I hear about suicide in later life. And I think it also exposes, again, some ageist beliefs around, well, it's too late to change at a certain point, right? If someone's depressed in their mid 70s, that's normal, right? Or can't be treated successfully. And so, yeah, the lack of attention or alarm bells going off about suicide in later life, I think really exposes some of these assumptions or these really unfortunate beliefs.
I wonder if there's an element of shame going on, right? What the face behind the macho mask
Yes.
in a cultural way.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think getting older and feeling more vulnerable
Uh,
to bad things.
Feeling more human. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, right? I think for men who uphold themselves to a fairly traditional idea of masculinity, I mean, it can be quite destabilizing for them to feel vulnerable to illness, to be needing more help, to feel like a burden, coming back to our point from earlier. So I think yet another reason why masculinity can be a real prison for many of these men and make it that much harder to adapt to some of the challenges that come up in later life, get really nourishing forms of social support that can buffer them, right, with this type of distress. And also from just like getting involved in their communities and feeling like they matter in a different way than maybe they did in their working years.
I have a friend, a creative friend, an animator and artist, Lucia Martinez Rojas, that I've done many projects with. Lucia was recently in South Korea, and she was telling us that it was so quiet there, that she was very struck by how quiet the streets were. And everywhere she looked, people were on their cell phone. I guess even more so than in Colombia, South America, where she lives, and the United States, where we live. And our conversation also went into mental health. And there is a high rate of suicide in South Korea. And I did some research on this and watched some documentaries about this. And for South Korean men in their 40s, It's the number one cause of death. And they shared a whole host of influences on that cultural, economic, gender wars, that it's really a catastrophic thing that's going on in their country.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So, Kino, man that you are, join the conversation.
Yeah. I wanted to share an opinion on why we want to fix the wrinkles. And Julie, you can, you know,
Yes.
Now, is it your wrinkles or just my wrinkles?
just
To
what I
fix.
see out there, because I love to observe society. One is I'm going to go back to the word regret. So, for example, you in your 50s or in your 60s, and you've carried a whole lot of trauma with you from your teens. You got married at a young age. It was an abusive relationship. And at 55, you decide, okay, enough is enough. And I'm getting a divorce. I'm walking away. So you walk away. Now it's catch up time because you're living with that regret. So, I mean, as you said, Julie, it's $1 billion industry. It's all around us, wherever we go, whatever we watch, it's all around us. These companies are selling us these products day in, day out. So, of course, okay, this is my way out. This is how I am going to look 20 years younger. So I can find, a guy who's 20 and, I can get my youth back again. So that is what I observe. I see it happening all around in South Africa. Okay. So regret. And then the second thing is also social pressure, right? Your friends can be family members. You check them, with all these new products. So I'm like, okay, let me also do this. I see that happening in my own family. I'm honest like that. I see it. Maybe it'll be my mother and sister. Let me use them as an example. True story. So my sister would buy something, a new makeup product, whatever, anti-aging cream. So she shows it to my mother. My mother's like, yeah, okay, cool. Can you also get it for me? Or where can I get it? So that's what happens as well. So I just wanted to share my opinion on that. Would
I
you
love how
agree?
you use the phrase anti-aging cream.
Yeah, but yeah, because it's a true story, story. This is a non-fiction story. I'm not making this up.
Yeah,
So I
we
see it
believe
happening in
you.
my own family. Yeah. So would
And
you
add
agree
to
or
that social media with filters.
yeah,
So right, so
exactly.
can't even trust what somebody
Exactly.
really looks like.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
it. So there's
Yeah.
kind of
The moment
social
we get in
media
touch,
yeah, social
we're
media
not showing our
pressures.
organic self.
Yeah, yeah, your peer group
Yeah.
obviously, plays a role too in terms of kind of what's normal to them, what they're doing. I think the thing that's interesting is that, and maybe some of these pressures feel most acute kind of in the sort of early to midlife. But what we see in terms of research, and again, this is kind of averages based on large groups of people, but that as people get older, they actually tend to be more self accepting. So as people age, they're, that sort of stereotype that we care less about what other people think as we get older. And that to sort of extent is very much true. Less concerned about being negatively evaluated by other people. And so I think at a certain point, and of course, there's always exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, older adults become less preoccupied with what other people think and are far more focused on kind of marching to the beat of their own drum. And again, there's obviously exceptions and people who really struggle, especially people who put a great deal of value or get a lot of their self worth from their appearance and how they look and looking youthful. Perhaps people who work in particular industries where that's highly valued, right? They might be the exception to that. But at a population level, the general trend is I care less about what other people think about me. I'm more motivated to make sure that I'm maximizing my remaining time in life, which I mean sounds kind of liberating to me.
Yeah.
I forget the term for this. Maybe either of you know it. They use the word maxing. It
Yes.
has to do with like literally like taking a hammer to your face,
Yes, yes.
painting
Looks
your
that
jaw.
way. That's
But
right.
I
Yeah.
as you
Yeah, that's right. That's
that
yeah.
aren't experiencing that in themselves.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think maybe the shift is away from kind of like optimizing your appearance to more optimizing your experience, right? Really making
That's
sure,
wow. Praise, optimize your experience.
yeah, more so that you're kind of living as fully as you can. It doesn't always have to mean that you're driving a fancy sports car, but it does mean that you're more present and can really take satisfaction in, seeing the giggles, that come over your grandchild, or watching a sunset, right, while you're at the cottage in the summertime. It's kind of appreciation for these sort of simple yet powerful aspects of our experience that help us feel alive.
I'll speak more about men and mental health and suicide.
I don't know. I can't speak for every man out there. I don't know why, it's three times worse. I think I can also link it back to regret. If I had to take a shot in the dark, men, we tend to carry regret with us. That I can speak for, unfortunately, but not for myself. I have just never carried regret, ever in my life. I feel like anything that I've done in my life, I did it in that moment and I carry no regrets. Whether society saw it as you naughty, for example, as a teen, but I don't regret being naughty as a teen. It's crafted me into the person I am today. So, I mean, there could be many reasons why, but I feel like regret is one of those reasons. Julie, okay, I don't want to get older, right? No,
Well,
so like
there's only
when you're
one way
talking
that
about,
won't happen.
well, let me, like I'm going to explain why. So when you were talking about, as people get older, they start prioritizing, okay, I don't want to socialize more. I want to spend time with family more. So not all of us are both the same. And yes, I agree with you. There is a lot of people that want to prioritize their time. Okay, I'm not going to, get wasted with my buddies anymore. Let me spend time with my parents because, their time is limited or my time is limited. Who knows when any of us is going to go first. But when I say I don't want to get older is because I'm ambitious. So when I'm saying this, I'm also speaking for other ambitious individuals out there who are millennials now growing up. I feel like we are still growing up. Okay, so we're ambitious. We got goals. Myself, okay, I've been a DJ since a young age. I don't want to stop DJing. I don't want to stop podcasting. I don't want to stop making music. I don't want to stop being in nightclubs till 2 a.m. in the morning. So now the thing is that can also cause a lot of anxiety for someone like me because the reality of the matter is I am getting older. So will I still be able to DJ at 50 years old? Yeah, probably there's still a lot of DJs at 50, even 60. So what advice would you give someone like me right now?
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, is there an idea that like either your ambition will decrease as you age, or you won't be able to sort of actualize your ambitions, or you won't be physically capable of doing that? What's that about for you?
I feel like if I'm getting older, I don't have a lot of time. So instead of, say, for example, prioritizing time with family, which I know I still should do, but then the ambition takes over as well as I'm growing. So how
Yeah.
do I deal with that now as, an adult?
Well, I want to come back to so that the findings around what older adults prioritize. So it's less, it doesn't have to be family per se, but more it's that we prioritize the things that feel most meaningful to us and the relationships that feel most meaningful to us, which could be DJing for you, right? So, yeah, you could be in your 60s and 70s being like, I love how this feels and I want to soak all of this up for as long as I can. And so you may choose to prioritize that, right? So, it's really just depending on the individual, what feels meaningful to them in terms of what they prioritize, you know? And I would say that we don't have enough great role models of people in later life who are remaining ambitious, engaged, risk takers. We don't have enough kind of like sex symbols in their 70s and 80s that, like, I think if you can look to people in later life that are modeling to you this sort of like actualization of their ambitions, continued evolution and growth and development as a person, a physical strength and capability, like finding those people to be like, they did it, right? So maybe I can too. Some of the examples that I go to, so, if you're a music fan, are you familiar with Patti Smith?
Patti Smith. No.
Patti Smith. Yeah. Okay. Diane, you're nodding your head. So
Yeah.
Patti Smith was like punk rock queen in the 70s, right? Like a really important figure in the punk rock movement in New York in the 70s and early 80s. Patti Smith is now in her late 70s, and I saw her live 2 years ago performing up on stage, opening for the National. And in addition to that, she's written several books, some of which have won the National Book Prize. So she is someone who, has continued to evolve and be culturally relevant and instrumental and a powerhouse you know, well into her 70s. So finding those people for you that show you what's possible, I think is really important in terms of shifting your own beliefs about what's going to happen and what's possible for you in later life.
Okay. Thank you for that. And next question that comes to mind is, how do adults, I'm going to use my mother or my father as an example here. How do they hide their mental struggles? And what can we as children or anyone out there in the youth look for? Because I don't know, for me, adults tend to always hide their mental struggles. So what can I look for?
Yeah, so let's peel back a few layers there first. So, whether it's consciously hiding or they themselves not recognizing something might be important nuance here. We know that older adults tend to have lower rates of what we call mental health literacy, meaning that an older adult might not totally be aware that this persistent, state that they're in
Mm,
is depression, right? Or they may not know that what I'm experiencing is a panic attack, right? So they have less knowledge about what are the signs and symptoms and less knowledge about the fact that treatment's available and where to go to get treatment. So, one of the first things that's actually important for older adults is increasing their level of mental health literacy, ensuring that they have access to information that helps them make sense of their experience. Now, alongside that, sometimes stigma can contribute to like concealing or not wanting to share what's going on for them. And there can be certainly cultural differences in terms of stigma that's attached to mental health difficulties or kind of inaccurate beliefs about what's going to happen when you do go get help, right? So stigma can be another barrier. So, in addition to older adults getting information, really normalizing and helping older adults have realistic, beliefs and expectations about what happens when you go get help, I think is really critical. And maybe to answer your question in a different way, older adults can sometimes report different symptoms or present in different ways with mental disorders. So, for example, they might show up to their primary care physician and say something like, I haven't been sleeping very well. I feel exhausted and I can't seem to get enough sleep, every night. They might talk more about some of the somatic symptoms or physical symptoms versus going in and saying, geez, I'm so depressed. I feel so worthless, right? Or I've got so much guilt about the past I can't seem to get rid of. So in terms of your parents, right, you might want to be thinking a little bit about physically, right, what's going on for them. You might want to think about what kind of baggage or stigma are they bringing in about seeking help, and then what do they already know, right? What's their knowledge base? What's the information they have in terms of what they know about different mental health conditions, what the treatment options are, and what that's like if they were to do that.
Yeah, you're correct about the stigma. You know, what makes being a podcaster so easy for me is that anything I got to share is based on real events in my own life. You're 100% correct about the stigma. Like, I'm all about breaking cycles. I had to break a cycle in my own family as well, because that's how I was going to evolve and even be here today. And if I never, I wouldn't have known you two beautiful ladies today, right? So the thing is, when I broke those cycles, I saw the trauma within my own family. And now when you mentioned to your mother, maybe try therapy. No, why should I waste money on therapy? What does a therapist know? There's nothing wrong with me. So you get that type of response. And then what do I say then, Like, I can see it because I've broken the cycle, because I've recovered from the trauma myself, but they're refusing to do so. Then it's the other hand where you can see it also in another adult, within my family, and then things are not right and you're trying to get them to be open with you. But that also becomes a mission. So then I also am like, okay, let me pause this for now.
Yeah, I get that a lot. And I hear from, let's say adult children about how they maybe attempted to have these conversations with their parents, but their parents appear to be resistant, quote unquote, or stubborn, right? Or dismissive, to being like, what do I need that for? Now, although it's tempting to paint that as, resistance or stubbornness, what's going on underneath the surface might be something else entirely. right? So sometimes it's fear, right? I'm scared. I don't know what that's going to be like, or I'm scared of opening up Pandora's box, having to talk about things that are painful, right? So sometimes resistance is actually a reaction to feeling scared. Sometimes it's a feeling of someone feels like their autonomy is being threatened in some way, right? So someone is saying, I think you really need some help, right? Then that might be interpreted as like, well, you don't think I can manage this, or you don't think I'm doing very well, or you don't think I'm capable. So resistance or stubbornness can actually mean a bunch of different things to somebody. And so my suggestion to you, Kino, is when you are talking about this, try to, approach it more from open-ended questions where the goal is more to understand your parents' ideas about seeking help, right? So open-ended questions like, what do you think therapy would be like, right? Or what do you think you're struggling most with right now? Or, what strengths, do you think you bring to the table? Have you ever thought of getting additional help or support? What scares you about that? So open-ended questions, right, can help reduce defensiveness of the other person and help you be able to understand how do they make sense of this? Like, what are the barriers from their perspective? And, think of this as a series of conversations that you have, right? Not kind of one conversation where the goal is to persuade, but think of this as a series of conversations where the goal is to understand your parents' experience.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Even though I use myself as an example, there's many people out there in similar situations, so I bring up
Yeah.
these questions, because I also know what's going on, out there. Thank you for that.
Really, for anyone in the audience listening who might be struggling, feeling overwhelmed, or in some type of mental health crisis, even contemplating suicide, what would you say to that person, young or old?
Yeah. Well, I would say that those are real painful, difficult feelings. And unfortunately, feelings that a lot of people struggle with, in later life. And that as big and overwhelming as they can feel, that there is effective help available, right? So I would encourage them to try to get connected up to mental supports where possible and see how, let's say, even just in their local communities, they might be able to get involved with a cause that they feel is important to them or to actually put themselves in a role of helping somebody else, right? We know that helping others is a really powerful way to feel less lonely and also like you matter to somebody else. So if there was one small thing to do today, it's do something to help somebody else.
Can we learn more about you? Your website address, purchasing your book?
Yeah, so my website is drjulieerickson.com. And you can also follow me on social media. My handle is the Aging Psychologist.
That's a great handle. Great. Yeah, I want to thank you so very much, Julie. Just so warm, welcoming, and informative in so many ways. And I'd love to invite you back again. I think there's so much more that we can talk about.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me and for showcasing such an important yet like under discussed area. So appreciate your willingness to platform this topic.
Thank
Hey,
you.
I've just given you a follow on Instagram.
Amazing. Thank you. Amazing.
Thank you so much, Dr.